Thank you very much. So, iron is an essential part of the hemoglobin in red blood cells, the cells that carry oxygen throughout the body. Many of us get plenty of iron from red meat and dark leafy greens, or cooking in cast iron pots. People who don't get enough iron can become anemic. And iron deficiency anemia is still a big problem around the world. In Cambodia, 60% of the population suffers from iron deficiency. They don't get enough iron in their diets. And this affects women and children the most, but it also affects the Cambodian economy as a whole because the lethargy and cognitive issues that come from iron deficiency just make it very difficult to work normally. And because of this, a group of scientists went to Cambodia to try to work on this iron deficiency problem. And they thought, well, it's pretty simple. You know, if you just add some iron to the diet in any manner, the human body can absorb it, and that can fix the problem. So they thought, why don't we just very simply hand out pieces of iron to the women who make dinner? And then if they just have the iron in their cooking pots, it's very simple, it's very inexpensive. And this will get iron into the diet. So a Canadian grad student came and joined them, Chris Charles. He took a summer fellowship and he went to go work with these scientists. And his task was to get to work distributing these blocks of iron. And he learned some of the Khmer language so that he could communicate with them and say, okay, here, this is very good for your diet. It will help you, it will give you more energy for you and your children. And he went door to door and handed out the iron and explained it. And the women he spoke with nodded and smiled. And then when he left, took the ugly chunk of iron and used it as a doorstop. Because very few people wanted to put a scrap of metal into their soup for dinner. I wouldn't do it. I don't think any of you would either. And so Chris Charles went back to the rest of the scientists, I imagine with a very heavy backpack with a Canadian flag on it, full of these chunks of iron. And he thought, this isn't working. What can I do? Well, what if I made these chunks of iron a different shape? Could I make it a circle, a flower, something nice? And so then he did what none of these scientists thought to do. He went into these villages and talked to people. And he talked to very many people, and he talked to the village elders. And what he found out is that there's a fish, a common river fish, that people eat for dinner that's considered lucky. And he went back and did a little work, and he made little smiling fish out of iron. And bingo, he went back and he went to each house to these women and handed them a cute little fish, which looked like a natural thing to put in your soup. And they were happy. They took them and they put them in their cooking pots. And in the villages where this was being used, within 6 months, anemia rates were cut in half. And then these families began to tell other families that this fish was in fact lucky. Because it was actually bringing them health. And so there was no significant difference in the chemical composition between the chunk of iron and the smiling fish. From a quantitative perspective, they were identical. But the measurable success of the outcomes could not have been more different. Biochemical facts were no match for a good story, for folklore. And of course, treating anemia with a good luck charm only works if there's actually hard science behind it. Rational analysis alone, though, would never have produced this irrational solution. You can measure the quantity of iron that you should have in your diet, but no mathematical equation would have compelled those families to put the iron in their pot. He could have given them data sheets all day long and it wouldn't have changed anything. But, even though we know this is true, we know it's important to understand people, many leaders in technology and business are just as skeptical of ethnography as those women were of the scientists with their chunks of iron. And this is even more the case today when we can measure everything. When, we have computers in our pockets that we call phones and sensors in our watches and our cars that are measuring everything and calculating and generating and sharing data. And this is pretty creepy when you think about it, because not only do we have access to all human knowledge at the tips of our fingers, but everything we do is generating data. And we're sharing it on social networks, and we're uploading it to the cloud. And there's even businesses are trying to find more and more ways to measure this data. And in 2012, a couple of years ago, IBM made a big announcement that we create 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day. So much that 90% of the data we have in the world today, we've created and captured in the last couple of years alone. This is big data. It's so much data that it's too much for our computing power to really process, so we have to take random chunks to analyze. But it's not just big data. It's not just data so big that computers can't understand it. It's also data in even smaller sets that even we humans have a hard time understanding. And we even have data about how much we use the terms big data, which is a lot. We're using those words a lot, so it must mean something. But I ask myself, I say 90% of what? What does that vast quantity of information represent? Is it 90% of our knowledge, 90% of our culture, 90% of anything that matters to us? But throughout history, very smart people, great minds, have tried to find a way to have a logical, mathematical formula to describe and control the chaotic world that we're born into, because that's very scary. But all of that data, 90%, is it more significant to humanity than Shakespeare, than the Bible, than the work of all the Nobel laureates in the world? What does that really mean? I mean, we're starting to really use it for things. People think it's important because capturing all this data is changing the way humans think about themselves, think about ourselves, and relate to one another. One example I came across is that in California, the Los Angeles Police Department is using software called PredPol for Predictive Policing, and it's based on an algorithm that predicts earthquakes, except they fed it crime data. And now this can predict where crimes are going to happen to within about 50 square meters. And where they're using it, burglary rates have dropped, violent crime has dropped, but you really have to ask, what are we doing when we're giving this power? I mean, especially, you've probably seen on the news what's happening with local American police departments. And that's very scary to think that's where humanity is going. And there's now a concept called dark data, which is all of the information that companies have been collecting about us, but just don't know how to use yet. But software is getting more and more sophisticated, so they will. So there are consultants out there saying, hold on to that dark data because we're going to help you figure out how to use it. And again, this is pretty creepy when you think about it. People who work with technology love the idea of data because they use that data to understand the world and make decisions. But is more and more data really helping humanity make better and better decisions? I don't think so. And that's what makes me very curious, is we want to think that all this information is making us smarter. But I'm not sure that's the case. So Douglas Adams, who sadly died pretty young, he wrote this fantastic book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I don't know if you've read it, you really should, but this book, I think, captures some essential truths about humans and how we relate to the universe. And if you've read the book, you might remember the parable of deep thought. So there were some pan-dimensional, hyper-intelligent beings who argued constantly about the meaning of life. They were always bickering, much like we do. And they got so fed up, they thought, we're going to build a computer that will get the answer for us so we can stop arguing with each other. And they built this computer, Deep Thought. And they said, Deep Thought, tell us the answer. What answer? Said Deep Thought. The answer to life, the universe, and everything. And this was a very smart computer, so it said, okay, I can do that. Give me 7.5 million years. Fortunately, these were pan-dimensional beings, so they hung out, and then they came back, and they were so excited. We're going to get the answer to the meaning of life. They said, Deep Thought, tell us, what's the answer? And Deep Thought said, 42. And they were sort of disappointed with that after 7.5 million years. And they kind of went to customer service with this and said, What's up with that? What's up with 42? And Deep Thought answered, it would have been simpler to know what the actual question was. Because only when you know the question will you know what the answer means. And this is really smart. Douglas Adams in 1978 had a pretty good handle on the issues. He knew how much people crave mathematical certainty in a messy and complex universe. He also knew that literally all the computing power in the known universe won't get us off the hook for finding meaning. No matter how perfect and powerful the system that gathers and processes the data, humans write the queries. We come up with the questions, and the questions we ask are what give the answers meaning. Without the right questions, it's like looking up in the night sky without knowing what the stars mean. The data we get is going to be just as meaningless as astrology. So getting back to folklore and myth and superstition, I'm really interested in the myth of the rational human mind that's been with us since the earliest Western philosophers, and the superstition that data can really tell us anything important. Because the human mind is terrible at processing mathematical data. We're storytellers. Even mathematical truths are open to interpretation and dependent on our abilities to understand them. I mean, if you look at these two red lines, one looks longer than the other, but mathematically, they're the same length. We can't get away from our brains. They're trying to trick us. And the worst trick they play on us is convincing us that we're being logical. We're not statistical thinkers. Unless we are highly trained and disciplined, when we look at data, we just see what we want to see. We fit that data to our stories. And the biggest story we tell ourselves is that we know what's going on. And that's rough. So for any goal that we have, how do we get from what exists, from what we can see and measure, to what should exist? How do we get from what is, from what ought to be? This is the fundamental question of design and business and government. But we can't measure our way there. When we start with a true understanding of human experience, rather than abstract data or wishful projections, we have a much better chance. Because unlike when we have a physical problem, like we know if our ankle is sprained, we know we can't run. But if we have a cognitive bias and we're only seeing what we want to see in the data, our brain won't tell us that we can't think right now. All of us are lazy, forgetful creatures of habit with these terrible cognitive biases. So there's another really great book by Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he describes how we humans make decisions with these two systems of thought. and they can create problems because they work very differently. System 1 is what we think of as our intuition. It operates automatically and quickly with no effort and no voluntary control. System 1 is what lets you think about what you want to make for dinner while you're driving the car and just somehow seem to manage to get home. It's fast, and it really gives us a sense of like, hey, I know, that feels true, that's my gut. System 2 is really slow, and it requires effort and thought. This is the system that lets you listen for one sound in a noisy room or check the validity of a logical argument. System 2 can think statistically, but it must be trained, and it takes a lot of effort. System 1 creates the best possible stories out of existing data. So if it feels coherent, it feels right. And in fact, having less information can make you feel more confident. And the brain kind of weeds out if you get new contradictory information. Well, you'll just think that's not true because it's messing with your story. And the story is what feels true because your brain is lazy, loves having it easy. So thought processes that feel easier and simple explanations just feel more true. We have these cognitive limitations. And ironically, they prevent us from understanding how well things are working. And now as a species, we have this new ability we're so excited to use. We can track and measure things we could never track and measure before. But data won't tell us what to do because we'll look at that data and just create a story that sounds good and we'll believe it, and everybody we tell will believe it. And this is the essential paradox of so-called data-driven decision-making. Our precious myth of human rationality makes us prefer basic decisions on quantitative data over mere stories. Any leader who wants to think that they're rational and decisive is going to say, show me the data, not tell me the story, even though that data probably just fits into a story anyway. So I want all of us to acknowledge that humans will never reduce to an engineering problem to solve. If we treat people like that, that's when terrible things will happen because we'll try to let the data tell us what to do. We'll try to get off the hook for our responsibility to understand what's right and effective and ethical to do with that information. So we need to approach the data we collect and generate and make decisions based on with empathy and with a real sense of responsibility to each other and care, and a realistic sense of how good we are at thinking, so it's always good to have a buddy to keep your biases in check. And by describing and measuring and using the best qualitative and quantitative data we can find, we can do good work and make good choices and really change the world for the better. And maybe that'll give us a little bit of luck. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erika Hall.